Stop accusing me of stuff. I have a friend who calls like that. But thank you. I should try orange. Perfect. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker of the affirming team.
No. Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Wait, we need this.
What is that? Oh my god. Thank you, Nakash. We are the side of the house that stands for thinking independently and not having to accept what you've been told. So, to start with some setup. What does widespread adoption look like? In high school English classes, in universities, in academic discussion, and general discourse over books, the author's intended meaning is not held any higher than any other interpretation on our side of the house. These interpretations are up for the reader to form. So, on to what I'm going to be doing in the speech. Firstly, I'll be doing why there are often many ways to interpret a book, then on to two substantives, the first being how people engage with literature better on our side of the house, and why there is more meaningful analysis. So, why are there often many ways to interpret a book? People's views and values may influence the ways people interpret a book. If you come from a different background, you're more likely to see something differently than someone from a completely different background and area to you. For example, you'd be more sympathetic with characters who are experiencing a similar struggle to you, therefore you may place more importance on them when analysing the story. It can also look like a character who acts badly, and a reader from a similar background may try justifying their actions. So literature is fundamentally limited in how much it can say. People do have to fill in the blanks, therefore that's why there's always some form of interpretation in a piece of literature. So, to start with my first point, how people engage with literature better, 5 reasons to why this is true. The first being that the experience is more meaningful to the reader, because the meaning of the book is more to align with the meaning of their worldview and their past experiences. Comparatively, the meaning the author had is not as personalised to them, and it's not going to be as engageable or as relatable. So as the reader has consumed this piece of literature, they're going to form their own opinions of it. Of course, like I said, these views will align with their values, and the way of the author may not. Secondly, people have different meanings of the text upon first reading. They are told that they are wrong because in non-death of the author context, by their teachers or their peers if their interpretation differs from the author's meaning. Why this is bad? It devalues the text for them, because they go from their own personalised meaning to the author's meaning. This is because in school they are taught how to think and what to think, and if the author's meaning is there, and they've made it obvious, and they've said in interviews what it is, then that is what they're expected to conform to, and how they're going to be marked on. Thirdly, kids. Kids are inherently imaginative, and they think that, and they like having the freedom to think and the freedom to imagine things. They will get more out of this when they are not being told how to think or what perspective to take. As a result of being told what to think, they will be less motivated to read or put little to no effort into consuming literature from here on, because they assume that the death of the author concept is not throughout, and they'll just assume that they'll always be corrected in what they're thinking, therefore demotivating them. Fourthly, it changes the scope of literacy analysis to be more historical. So instead of focusing on the book itself, we're focusing more on what the author was thinking at the time. Therefore, people who enjoy reading but don't like the historical stuff will then lose interest, because why would they really care what's going on in the past? They're just really there to enjoy the literature, and they are now not interested in what's going on. Yeah, I'll take a POI.
Isn't one of the most important purposes of reading is to engage with different perspectives that you wouldn't get when you're just viewing literature through your own experiences?
Absolutely, and I'll get to that in my more meaningful analysis part of my speech. Final reason for this, fifthly, people are less involved in discourse because they don't know much about the author. They don't know much about the author. Because, like I said in my last mechanism, it's because people who don't enjoy reading, they're not really interested in the author, they're just there for the book, they aren't going to have any meaningful contributions to these discussions that focus mainly on what the author was thinking at the time, and therefore will lose interest in literature together, which is inherently bad for society. On to the impacts of this. 4 of these. The first, people enjoy literary analysis more when we have the death of the author. This means that they will work harder, get better grades, and be more active within the literature sphere. Beyond that, people will have a better association with literature as it hasn't been ruined by the school system enforcing upon them what they are to think and what perspective to take. They are more likely that they read after school, which is a good thing, because we all know the benefits reading can bring. It is an important part of society, it makes people more informed, and it is inherently part of our culture. It also sharpens the brain and expands the vocabulary, which we can all agree are good benefits. And finally, people can find pleasure in reading. With Death of the Author, they are given the freedom to interpret the meaning of the literature all for themselves, and then being able to engage in discussion with others about what they saw the meaning, not being forced upon them the author's meaning and being told that is absolute. Alright, on to second point, how we get more meaningful analysis. Some context for this. The purpose of literary analysis is to understand literature. This is what analysis means, just I'd like to make that clear. Why do we get a more meaningful understanding of literature? Well, firstly, the effects of literature is most apparent in how they affect people's ideas and opinions. This can clearly happen in ways that the author doesn't intend, and by not analysing other interpretations, you miss out on that understanding. Secondly, when analysing literary trends and movements, like how books and later impact later authors, it's much more determined by these authors' interpretations, not by other authors' intentions. So say an author wrote a very impactful book, and they had some a key intention when writing it. The thing that influences the time-lapse of literature is not what the author intended it to, but is what these following authors intended it to be, and that is how we progress forward in the literary scope. By allowing the freedom to analyse separate from the author's intention, there is a more relevant and meaningful analysis of literature. And this is crucial to our case. The outcomes of this. Firstly, people better understand how different texts fit into the world as a whole. This is important because literature is integral to our culture and our understanding of history and the history of knowledge and themes within culture and society. A better informed population is just better overall. This is a outcome that we can all agree is positive, and on our side it is more proficient. And secondly, in Neg's world, people are turned away from literary analysis because it is so much less relevant and less interesting. For example, no one really cares what Karl Marx, one person, was thinking when he wrote his book. This was so much less important than how much the interpretations of his book impacted the world as a whole. Now, had people just been told exactly what Karl Marx was thinking at the time, and then being just told, okay, go away with it, that's it, lesson over, none of these impacts would have happened. And the impacts of interpretations, and by consuming this literature and having different interpretations of it, is critical to our development of knowledge and our development as a culture as a whole. Proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the first speaker of the meeting.
We think that by changing what the author's intention is and using your own interpretation is only going to lead to the quality of literature both getting worse and probably to some very harmful misinterpretations of a lot of literature that we have. Three things for you in my speech today. Firstly, on some setup, my first point will be on how the author's version is more valuable than reader interpretation. Second point will be on how we get better quality of literature on our side. I have lots of rebuttal, but it will be mostly integrated. Okay, firstly on setup here, we pretty much agree with the affirming side's definition on this. Like, we think this looks like, your education system, book talk if you want to talk about that, and then your critics, pretty much, yeah. We also want to talk a little bit about how authors actually create purpose in their literature. So we think this is done through a lot of things, just the way they write it, through their use of language, their metaphors, their symbolism. And we also think that most of what we'd be talking about here would be books that actually have a lot of this deep metaphorical messaging, things like allegories such as Animal Farm, which is a whole extended metaphor about communism. We think that this is these are the types of books where this mostly applies to, as opposed to your average Colleen Hoover novel, things like that, okay? All right, so first point on how the author's version is actually more valuable than reader interpretation. So what is the context here? So authors often make a lot of very political and very moral statements with their literature, right? I just gave you the example of George Orwell's Animal Farm, which was all about the communism in Russia, right? And so we think that that literature is often used as a way to spread a lot of different messages and a lot of different opinions. First mechanism here is that we think that looking under F side, people can actually get a lot of potentially harmful misinterpretations, when they're just relying on their own political, their own opinions, right? Because as Af have stated, that people are probably going to be using their own personal experiences, using their own personal opinions and everything that they already know to make these interpretations, right? And we think that when you're taking parts of books and reading them and taking it out of context and trying to flip it a different way to a way that fits your perspective and fits your own opinion, we think that this is far too easy for people to do, because it's just your own experience, so it's familiar and easy. But we also think that it means that people miss the entire interpretation of their book, and they don't actually get an understanding of where the author is coming from. They aren't absorbing a different opinion or trying to understand a different opinion. They're just reading something and going, how can I make this so that I agree with it? How can I make this so that it fits with my personal experiences, instead of trying to understand somebody else's perspective? Okay, secondly, we think that education from literature is now going to be more shallow and frankly just less quality, because people aren't going to be trying to understand another person's perspective. They aren't going to be trying to understand the true meaning of where the author was coming from when they wrote their book, when they wrote their poem, their piece of literature, because they just revert to comparison with their own opinions. It means that they aren't having their own opinions challenged. We heard a lot of this from Af's side about how it's important that people have their can use their own opinions to view literature. We think this is actually very, very harmful. We think it is good for people to be questioned on the political views that they hold, on the personal on the personal prejudices and view the experiences of others and just view the world through a different lens. We think this is really, really good, and we don't think that people should just be reverting to their own personal opinions when they do this. And so it just means that people don't actually absorb a different view. The comparison under our side of the house, right? People are actually forced to, look at a book and have a different interpretation of it, right? They have to actually sit down and try and understand somebody else's perspective, understand somebody else's situation, and it means that you can actually have to pay attention, and you can't just ignore the true meaning of the book. Thirdly, we think that you're probably going to see less wider literacy as a result in places such as the media, because it means that when people go out into the wider world and they go online and start to read things, or they go on TV and see the politicians talking, right? It means that they don't have that ability because they haven't learned to do that while they are in school, interpreting books, because they've just been told use your own opinions. It means that people, when they go out and see this, they can't make different interpretations. They can't form different opinions, understand other people's opinions. When they see the politicians arguing on TV, they're never going to try and understand what their other sideness in society on our side, because people are forced to like try and understand other perspectives, we think there's going to be like less extreme opinions and just more acceptance of people from different backgrounds, of people who have different opinions of you, and just more like acceptance and tolerance in society in general. On their comparison, they are encouraging like closed-mindedness and for people to like keep their blinders on and have a one-sided view of the world. Secondly, we think there is going to be less critical thinking because people don't learn to try and understand alien concepts or try and understand different perspectives. So we think this means that society is probably going to like become quite disconnected long term if we just like keep encouraging this like lack of like exploration into different ideas. And we think this means that people probably just become less progressive because we get so stuck in our ways and like stuck in like our own opinions, and we just aren't open to change. Okay, I will take a POI briefly.
Is it not more valuable for people to consume literature, form an opinion, then discuss their interpretations and influence of opinion, than being told the definitive perspective that may be just gaslighting from the author?
I think it's good that people read the author's opinion, fully understand the author's opinion, and if they don't agree with the author's opinion, they can then dispute it. I don't think it's good for people to completely ignore the author's opinion and make it something that it's not, because that isn't analysing, that's just being ignorant. Okay, second point on how our side gets better quality of literature. So a little bit of context here. We want to talk about how like authors are often very critiqued, like firstly very critiqued for what they message in their books, and secondly, sorry, oh my god. Secondly, art in the form of literature is often like very specific with how it is written, and authors often put like a lot of time and effort into like making specific messages for people. So what are our mechanisms here? Firstly, we think like just a little bit more about like how human nature actually works, right? People can literally like find meaning in like whatever they want. Like you can literally look at the color of the chair and like analyze like why you think the color of the chair has meaning, right? Like people are wired like that to just overthink and overthink. And so I think this means that like when you allow people to just like have their own opinions, like when they're reading, well not have their own opinions, like have their own perspectives, like singularly define like how they view a book, it means that like authors no longer feel incentivized to write like books with purpose and write books with meaning that spread like different political or like moral messages, because people are just going to go and interpret it their own way anyways and completely ignore them. So it disincentivizes them. Secondly, it takes away from like the purpose of art, right? Because these authors literally spend like probably years trying to form a piece of literature which is going to spread like a massive message to like people and spread like a positive message or a different perspective to people. And then if people like just go, okay, I'm just going to interpret this my own way and just like ignore the messaging, we think this is probably going to be like quite harmful to authors like in terms of artists. And they're probably, not only will they be disincentivized to actually like write good quality stuff now, they're probably going to be like discouraged to write anything that has like a deep message, that is actually like good quality and has layers to it, because you know they can write like a Colleen Hoover novel and people will sit there and analyze that and try and find just as much meaning in it through like their own opinions. Okay, so what are the impacts? Firstly, we think that people just become less educated because they aren't making like critical assumptions about things, and we think that authors are probably going to feel like they lose purpose, and this is why we think this should fall.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the second speaker of the examination.
a few things to do in this speech. Firstly, on value and interpretations and engagement, and secondly, on the quality of literature and of analysis. Right. What do we hear from Neg on value and engagement? The first thing they tell us is that people are going to read text and just get massive misinterpretations. They're going to miss the point of the text. I think the first thing to note here is that it's unclear what this actually looks like. People can't just flip an entire story to be a misinterpretation. You're still reading the same book, you're still consuming the same content, and so I think it's probably fair to say that you're going to have pretty similar experiences with the text. But secondly, it's just unclear why disagreeing with what the point of the text is. It's unclear why disagreeing with that is actually a bad thing. We think it's good for people to feel affirmed and interested in the text that they're reading, because that's when you get engagement. That is the only point at which you get any of the benefits that Neg wants you to get. The next thing then is that they tell us that death of the author doesn't allow for engagement with different ideas. It leads you to just be stuck in a cycle of your own political views and stuff like that. The first thing to say is that we get more engagement because we have a wider range of viewpoints being shared. Under Neg, there is literally only one viewpoint discussed, and that is that of the author, right? With death of the author, you get everyone forming their own unique viewpoints, which are probably going to differ because everyone has different lives and different experiences, and then these people then share them. That looks like seeing TikToks with minutely different or subtly different interpretations to you. It looks like your class members all having different interpretations to you. That is when you get people being open to the widest range of viewpoints under death of the author. But secondly, for kids who are people who just don't necessarily have super concrete values and beliefs that are just going to shape the way that they read, that they interpret the text, and they're going to be super stubborn, right? We tell you that it's the process of consuming the text and undergoing the critical thinking to analyze the text, to look at the character and think, okay, is what they did right? Do I agree with that? That's that's probably a pretty good thing to have people do, to look at these unique scenarios and make these decisions for themselves. That is when you get critical thinking, right? Because the alternative under Neg is just that you're being told what to think. You're being taught to an exam to write, oh, the authorial purpose is this. That is not something that actually leads to critical thinking. In fact, it's the opposite, because you're never telling people to form their own viewpoints. They're forced to believe one thing. But thirdly, we tell you that Neg just doesn't necessarily engage with our material about engagement. When people never feel affirmed or interested in the literature that they're consuming, whether that's in class or for their own enjoyment, they're never going to continue reading this literature. They're never going to get any of these benefits, because they just drop English as soon as they can. Right. Now for my substantive contribution on what differing interpretations actually look like. I think it's really important because I think it was probably just mischaracterized from Neg. The first thing to say is that it looks like different characterizations of the themes and the big ideas in literature. Right? We tell you that modern texts tend to be pretty complex and cover just various topics and themes. And it's because A, literature is a reflection of society, and society is just a place of disagreement and division. But B, it's just this makes just for a more interesting and sellable story. When your story is complex and generates discourse, it'll probably just sell better and lead to more success for the author. What this means then is that there's just lots of scope to be making value judgments and interpretations. It looks like in deciding when you read We, which is a Russian book about communism and collectivism, deciding whether or not it is a critique of collectivism or not, or whether or not it's in support of that, because you have these complex, clashing content points being discussed. But secondly, it looks like individual techniques and moments within these texts at the very micro scale. We tell you that the focus under Neg on the author's purpose gives rise to just being told that every single action made by the author was all for a reason. The exact purpose of a metaphor, for example, is probably just unclear insofar as it relies on very slight subtleties and differences. But when you're constantly being told that there is a right way to interpret these subtleties, is when you get different viewpoints, is when you get people not feeling affirmed. The impacts here of this engagement is firstly when you have differing views on themes. When you're constantly being told that your analysis of an entire text is wrong and that you should only listen to the author, you probably just stop caring about making these judgments because you know that it's not going to get you anywhere and that you're going to get a not achieved on your assignment. That's when you get people not engaging in literature. But secondly, individual techniques and moments, right? When you're told that you have to make certain and specific interpretations of each and every word in the text that are probably realistically just subjective because they are such subtle differences, that's when you get kids frustrated in the classroom, hating English class, never reading unless they're forced to. What do we then tell you on engagement? We tell you that firstly, the experience of like dealing with text is just more personalized and meaningful to you. Secondly, people are just inevitably going to be told that they're wrong when they like differ from the author's view under neg. Thirdly, like a kid's imagination is stifled when they're told exactly what the correct interpretation is. Fourthly, it changes the scope of like literary analysis to being more just like historical, which again just isn't that interesting for most people because there is no scope to make your own judgments. And fifthly, people just don't know much about the author. It's going to be hard. They're not going to enjoy it. Going to enjoy literary analysis. What then is the impact of this increased engagement? I think at our worst, you're just getting people enjoying class more and being more motivated to succeed academically in English class. But at our best, you're getting more developed critical thinkers who feel actively involved in decision making, who understand that there is nuance to every single interpretation of every single piece of literature in the world, who understand that everyone has a different viewpoint because they were exposed to different viewpoints as a kid. These people are then more likely to engage in the issues that affect the world around them, and all the nuance that follow these issues. They're more likely to do things like debate and just become more meaningful change makers in society. These are the impacts that we're proud to stand for. Next then, on the quality of text and the meaningfulness of analysis. We hear from Neg that people can find meaning in whatever they want, and so authors are just no longer going to be writing books. I think the first thing to note here is that authors are probably writing for themselves more than they are for other people to be agreeing with them. If they wanted everyone else to have the same views as them, they wouldn't be authors, they'd be politicians. The reason that these authors are authors is because they want to convey the imaginative nuance that they have on the issues that affect them personally in a way that gives them the liberty to have the freedom. They're writing for themselves. I don't think the authors are suddenly going to not care because people in the classroom aren't looking at exactly what they did. But secondly, authors just have faith that interpretation will just broadly be the same, because in a lot of the cases it is just minor subtleties and people will disagree with them. And then I think the final thing to say that I already mentioned earlier is that the words just still have inherent meaning. It's not like people are just going to read your text and think something entirely different. I think more analysis is needed from Nick here. What did we then tell you to no response on why we get more meaningful analysis at Riley? The first thing to say is that the effects of literature is most appreciated in how they affect people's ideas and opinions. Secondly, when analysing literary trends and movements, how books impact later authors is much more determined by the author's these later authors' interpretations rather than the original author's interpretations, right? We tell you that by allowing freedom to analyse separate from the author's intentions, you just get better analysis of the text because there's just more scope to have nuance in this text. We tell you that people just better understand how different texts fit into the world as a whole. They're able to appreciate the value of literature in critiquing society in a way that is specific to them and not just specific to the author that wrote it. Proud to stand for engagement.
And now I'll come up the second speaker of the negation.
Wait, can I get the phone, please? Thank you. Trying to live in a world where the meaning of the entire communist manifesto is purely based in an individual's interpretation as opposed to the original meaning of the author is ludicrousy and is how we ended up with the communist revolution in Russia. Okay, a few things I'll be doing for you in my speech today. Firstly, Ella's impact on her last point. Secondly, engagement with meaningful analysis. And thirdly, on the content around engagement into literature. Fourthly, onto my split on how we miss holistic overviews when analysing literature. Okay, what were the impacts of Ella's final points?
of Ella's final point. She said that people are going to start to enjoy literature more because it's more nuanced, because it focuses more on like a whole variety of things, and because you hear different opinions that you might not have been capable of considering prior to this because of your own personal life and your own personal experiences. And we also see like higher levels of education under our side because people care more about how nuances and different things impact on like other people that again they haven't necessarily been taught to consider under their side. Okay, now going on to the meaningfulness of analysis. So what did we hear? We heard that like literature affects people's behavior and that this is really bad because like, I don't know, an author can dictate how like the messaging, right? Of course this is true, but I also think that like it can be flipped, right? It can be a lot worse when personal interpretation comes into play, when people choose to change the words of this author and to misconstrue their initial meaning. I'm sure if Karl Marx was around when Stalin started to like take over the like Soviet Russia, he probably would have said, hey buddy, this is not really what I meant when I made up socialism, right? Like I just completely think that like example is quite ridiculous but also helped our case. We also heard that people are going to give more relevant analysis because they can connect to this. Of course it is great if you can consume something that you feel a personal relation to, but the reasons and all the harms we've pointed out to only consuming media that is relevant to you in your day-to-day life is incredibly harmful, right? What we see when we see this more nuanced, like direct perspective, you literally just see more perspectives in the literature that you are consuming. And the reason for this is because that individual also has their own personal experiences. You have not lived their life, you do not have their opinions, but you are able to consume this and to see this and to see more opinions by directly understanding what their messaging and meaning is behind it. We also heard that authors write for the purpose of writing and not for the purpose of sending messages. I think in the context of this debate, these authors do write with a purpose of sending a political message. Obviously, you are not going to be reading like a rom-com fantasy for their amazing political messaging or for their comments on society, right? But when you go and you read an allegory, you probably are curious as to what these political views are and how that works. And I also want to say, we don't get no personal interpretations of like, is this good, is this bad? Because I think everyone just has the ability to freely think, but we can now see why this author might have this opinion within their text, or why this specific group of people behave the way that they do within society. For example, if you read a book about gang members in South Auckland, you might become more sympathetic to their scenario because you see the complex like societal impacts and reasonings behind why they behave the way that they do, as opposed to reading a book that says these people are horrible, that all they do is kill each other, all they care about is drugs and money. Okay, now secondly, onto the engagement into literature. Yeah, so we saw that this is going to be more meaningful to people because it's a similar alignment, again, similar impact or a similar response to before. Like, it's not good to constantly be consuming the same thing, right? Like, that is literally just what you see in like North Korea. They're constantly consuming the same media, right? Like, that's just how you start brainwashing people. We also heard that people are less free thinking because they are constantly told what to consider in our schooling and education systems. Again, I do not agree with this because I think when you are consuming something with a completely new perspective, you probably have to think about it more because you don't necessarily initially understand what's this guy going on about, why is this like so true, right? Like, you are literally forced into thinking about why these things are happening and why this author has written this book. Okay, and now onto what the second speaker was saying. They said that this is better because they get a wider range of content with different analysis. Again, I think you get different authors. You probably have some authors who have like very extreme like right-wing opinions that you could go read their books if you were interested in that, right? So we don't have like a sudden cap on like the range of like literature on our side, right? Like, this is always going to happen. And again, this difference in analysis is always going to be there because we all have different opinions and every author has a different reason as to why they are writing their book, why they are writing their poem. We also heard that people stop enjoying literature, specifically students, because they're constantly prescribed what to think. I think if you are genuinely sitting in class being so bored, that's probably just more a thing about you're not super into literature, right? Like, people who want to be bored or aren't interested in that sort of stuff aren't going to be less bored on their side, right? And then we also heard that kids' imaginations are stifled. I'm sorry, but I do not know of any 9-year-old who is literally going out and reading Animal Farm, right? Like, this idea is going to start being pushed in higher levels of education. For example, the end of NCA, where we are able to consider the nuance and the holistic perspectives. Okay, now I'm going to go on to my split. I'll take a POI.
Okay. Don't you agree that sometimes authors can have bad intentions, and you haven't given a single reason for why an author's interpretation is any more helpful to society than a person's own personal interpretation?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good POI. So I think the reason why an author's opinion might be less harmful, have less power, is again because we have more critical thinking ability, right? And because they're probably more capable of getting these nuances in through their text than an individual is able to do personally, right? Because it's human nature to stop at the first thing that you think of and go, this is it, this is the only meaning, he did not want to go any further into this. Okay, now going on to how you actually miss a holistic overview. Okay, so literature is oftentimes, the political literature is, at least, is based in a political climate of the time, right? So what this means is, sorry for that example, but Animal Farm was written around the time where the USSR was very prevalent, where they were very powerful and where this was very dangerous. So if you pick up that book the day after it is released or published, you probably are not going to go, Stalin. Like, that is not anyone's natural reaction, right? This took years and years of people going, look at all these things that George Orwell has done, like, look at all the books he's written, look at 1984. This is obviously a political message, which means his other works are probably also going to be political messages, right? Like, you literally have to consider everything about the author when you read a book under our side, which means that you can actually understand these really complex metaphors that they are going or likely to use, as Ella gave you at first. And another thing that influences, or another element of political climate that influences this, is going to be fear. So on this, we win the debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and now welcome up the third speaker of the filming team. I've also been asked to move the computer. Apologies.
Alright, I've got three things in this debate. Firstly, who gets better engagement with literature and who gets people liking reading and choosing to read more? Secondly, who gets more helpful and productive spread of ideas through this literature? And then thirdly, about a largely unresponded to point about how I get a more and useful and relevant understanding of literature when we focus on the effects that this literature has, rather than one single author's view that they had when writing this literature. This came out of first and wasn't really responded to. The first thing I'll clarify though is just a bit about the scope of this debate, because I know we've talked a lot about the Communist Manifesto, but there actually are more books than that. There's a lot of like fiction literature that maybe isn't, you know, like literally propaganda about communism, which has like more scope to the value that people get from this literature is often a lot more than like political ideologies, right? We told you, and I think we all intuitively understand, that lots of people read books for entertainment, for enjoyment, and also just to get sort of a general understanding about the world and different people's experiences. And it's unclear about, say you're reading like a famous historical novel that isn't a Communist Manifesto, right? There's like not really any scope to misinterpret this to the point where you like get actively like less understanding about that context, because you're reading words unless you're just like blankly looking at the page and then just thinking your own thoughts instead of reading it. You're quite clearly going to be learning something about what the author is trying to say. Their whole point about misinterpretation just doesn't really make sense for things that aren't like political manifestos. And even if they are political manifestos, I mean, again, just don't think that the point of misinterpretation to where you're just reinforcing your own ideas makes any sense. Clearly, if you're reading something, you're going to like have that knowledge imparted onto you. That's just how reading works, okay? So, I sort of got off track, but the point is that there are more books in the Communist Manifesto. So then, on to our point about how we get more engagement and more people wanting to read. We told you pretty clearly why this system of telling people that their interpretations are wrong if they're not the same as the author, which is pretty unlikely because everyone has their own interpretation, puts people off reading, right? We told you how giving kids less freedom in class, even if they are teenagers, kids still like reading, they like imagination, just makes them like it less. This leads to a bad association with reading, they're less likely to want to read and partake in discussions, yeah?
Do you think that if we stop considering the author's intention of an apple tree dying when the main character is further ostracized for like being gay, that this is going to still be picked up by this like year 13 student who literally does not care about English?
How do we like, why would the author write a book if no one can understand it without like being the author? It just doesn't make any sense. Quite clearly books like impart knowledge and you don't need to be the author to understand it. It just doesn't make sense. Anyway, so when we see less people wanting to read because they have this bad experience in school, we see that they can't really claim any of the benefits they want about people being like more worldly and knowledgeable because they just aren't reading. We also tell you that they just lose the benefit of reading, being enjoyable, being fun. We don't really stand for that. And then there are major harms when people don't want to read because the education system makes them enjoy it less. Okay. Secondly, onto the spreading ideas. I've already talked on this a lot, but like people don't just read books to deliberately misinterpret everything and reinforce their own ideas, because this just doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense at all. Okay, so, but we also tell you that like, I don't know why I've written this, but I'll say it anyway. Okay, we give a speech to an adjudicator, right? We all acknowledge that it doesn't matter what I'm trying to say in the debate. It's about how you interpret it. I don't get speaker points for like the mechanisms that I want to say, but don't convey properly, right? It's sort of that, like, the interpretation of a text is just inherently more important than like what I was thinking when I was writing it. Okay. We also tell you that people who don't want new ideas just don't read, because why are you reading? They're just not relevant. They gain nothing. So a lot of their harms fall out of the debate. So we tell you that what these people do value when they're reading is finding out new knowledge, learning from the author, or at least getting entertainment. And we think that even if there is some scope for their own interpretation of maybe the specifics of the plot points, why characters do what they did, in general, they're still going to get the benefits of like understanding the context that they're reading, understanding like the human condition, things like that. We just think is beneficial, and we just don't think that people are going to read normal books and then that's going to radicalize them because they'll somehow interpret it as like reinforcing their own political opinions. Okay, so a lot of this stuff about how reading books reinforces your own political opinions just doesn't stand. But what we do tell you, and I've told you down the line, is that when you read books and have the freedom to interpret certain parts to be more relevant to you as a person and your own experiences, you just get more out of the book, you form more of an emotional connection with it. and you're more likely to absorb it. You know what? I actually will take another good one.
Don't you think it's more boring for kids when they're sat in class and told that they have to use their own perspectives that they've written about 100 times over when they're writing the English essay instead of trying to find like a new opinion that the author's bringing?
No. I'll tell you why. I will tell you why. It's because, like, why the hell do I care what this random guy thinks? I clearly care a lot more about what I think. I also take that a lot rather talk about what I think than what some random guy thinks. And thirdly, I think that there are more interesting conversations in class when lots of people are talking about what they each think than when everyone is just talking about what this random guy thinks. Which brings me on to the exclusive part of our case about why we get benefits in discourse and in the spreading of ideas. Because necessarily when people are discussing literature on their side, they're only discussing one opinion and one interpretation. They talked a lot about how we get more interpretation on their side, more diverse opinions. I just don't get it. Like, clearly when you have books and there is the freedom for people to share their own interpretation and they're each seen as valid without one particular interpretation, which is just by coincidence the author's intention, taken priority, we clearly get more varied discussion. So, at the end of this point, what you should think is that books still have the capability to spread ideas when people have the freedom to interpret them. We think that they are more effectively able to spread ideas when people are invested and interested in talking about them and forming their own opinions about them, because kids don't really just want to be told what to think. Thirdly, onto literary analysis sort of outside of the individual context, maybe in the more academic context. We gave you reasons for why analysis of the effects of books is just more relevant than the analysis of authors' intentions, right? Because an author is just one person at the end of the day, and their literature is always going to be a lot more interesting, important, and relevant than their own personal life, right? Like, Karl Marx himself didn't have that much of an effect on history through his day-to-day life, right? But what he did have an effect on history with is the ideas that he imparted on everyone else. So therefore, how these ideas were interpreted and why they spread the way they did is just way more relevant historically than what Karl Marx had for breakfast the day that he wrote the Communist Manifesto and why that might have changed the way that he wrote certain things. So at the end of this, what we think is that by limiting your analysis of literature to only the one specific viewpoint that the author had, we just reduce the scope of what literature can actually do in affecting the world historically and affecting other literature, which just leads to a worse understanding of literature, which we think is very harmful.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and now invite up their third negating speaker to conclude the substantive portion of today's debate.
We think that one of the most important parts about literature is that it expands humanity's capacity to create, and it allows for the broadening of perspectives. 3 points of clash in this debate. First of all, around who gets more meaningful analysis with a quick clarification beforehand. Second of all, around who gets a larger scale of engagement. And thirdly, less importantly, what role does the author's purpose play in this debate? On to my first point of clash around who gets more meaningful analysis, I would just like to point out quickly that under our side of the house, people can still interpret things the way that they want. We are not putting mind barriers in people's minds to think, oh, this author only has one purpose, they only have one meaning in their book. We think that within the move, we just mean that the meaning of the book will be widely accepted for what the author believes it to be, but we still think that it is important for people to be able to make their own interpretations and come up with ideas of what the author's purpose might be through their own reasoning. What we've heard from the first, from Ab is that when stories are complex and creates discourse, they are better. We actually agree with this. But we think that people don't actually see the complexities if they're looking from their own perspectives. We think that if a story is so nuanced and complex, it does take multiple people and it takes multiple perspectives to properly understand this. I think that if you're one person looking from one perspective and one viewpoint, you fail to properly understand the thing that the author is getting at, and I think you only end up seeing the world from one point of view. My previous speakers have explained why this is harmful.
Yeah, why?
We hear that these books a lot of the time contain historical stuff that people don't really care about. I have two main responses to this. First of all, that people do care about this stuff because it is relevant and it is interesting. It is interesting to many people to find out the way that the world works, how this impacts the way that we act today. And second of all, is that people should care. If you are really reading, and as Af claims, people read because they want to know stuff, how can you claim that you do not care about the historical factors that have influenced the making of that book and have influenced how we perceive it to be? For example, the environment of the author does impact the way that literature develops. I don't really want to use this example again, but again, Karl Marx. If we understand the way that his society ran, we can understand what he meant and what he get at. This means that we get less misunderstanding. We have less people taking this out of context and using these ideas that were supposed to be good, that were supposed to help people, to be really harmful weapons of destruction that we see throughout society. We also hear a lot about kind of forced perspectives and people being forced to look at things like a certain way. We disagree with this. I don't really know what school you go to, but at mine they don't say you must look at it a certain way. Actually, Arthur Miller only had one purpose when he was writing The Crucible. Shout out to my English teacher. But at school we are encouraged to explore a variety of viewpoints, which means you're not just looking at one author, you're looking at multiple authors. And if you're applying this exact same perspective to every single author, to every single context, to every single different type of book and different form of literature that you are reading or that you are taking in, then that means that you are not getting fully out of it everything that you can. Because if you're not understanding why it was written, what are you getting out of it? On to my second point of clash around who gets a larger scale of engagement. We hear that people get engaged, we hear that there is more engagement because people have their different perspectives and different experiences which they then can apply and feel is relatable to this book. However, I would like to point out that this directly contradicts what the second speaker said at the beginning of his speech, where he said that people cannot flip the meaning of the books because everybody has similar perspectives and will all think the exact same thing. I'm not entirely sure how our team can sit here and claim that people will all have the exact understanding when they read a book, but also that the thing that people are getting out of reading books when they're only taking it from their own understanding of it is that they have different perspectives. I would like a clarification on this. Again, the whole thing about people being told what to think, I think that authors also have multiple purposes in their book. If you're an author and your book is single-faceted, there is only one single meaning behind this that people are led to, you are not a very good author, you are not creating a very good book. And second of all, again, if you are a good author, your purpose is to make people think. It is not just to tell people what to believe. A good author makes you question your beliefs, it makes you question the way that the world works and what you can do to be better. I'll take a POI.
If an author has done a good job, won't they have tried to ensure their message comes across in the reader's interpretation?
Yes, and so hopefully the reader will be interpreting it the way that the author's purpose is supposed to be. Okay. Alright, the last point of clash is about what role does the author's purpose play in the debate. We hear that authors write for themselves, not because they care about others. I would just like to say the authors write because they have a message, because they want to educate people or because they want to entertain. However, I would also just like to point out that this kind of falls out of the realm within the debate because it is quite separate to what we are discussing. We think that it is so frustrating for an author when you're trying to create something, when you're trying to leave a legacy and leave a mark on the world, when people are not understanding what you are getting at. Because what is the point of writing something if people do not understand it, if people are simply seeing what they first see when they read those words? We think that this means that there is less effort being put into literature. We think this means that the quality of literature does decline, which is bad for everybody because it means that we cannot claim the enjoyment out of literature. We think that future authors will be more inspired when an author has a powerful message and it is understood and it is conveyed in their text, rather than if they go and say a bunch of words which is just understood by everybody in a different way that is not really true to how the author meant it to be. We hear that there is more scope to literature than just the Communist Manifesto, that there is a whole range of fictional literature that people can look at, that people can understand, that is more than politics. That means that people get enjoyment out of this and have different perspectives. I think that people can still enjoy things while they are learning facts. I think that while your perspectives are being challenged and your viewpoints are being challenged by books that you are reading, as you're accepting the author's purpose and not simply as you see it, that this is more entertaining. I think it is very boring to go through life without being challenged, with everybody saying, yes, you're right, or with your viewpoint being applied to every single thing and not actually learning anything, not actually thinking. Because I think a big reason why people actually read is to think, is to learn more knowledge, and is to be entertained. The burden that our team has in this debate to win over our points are to improve that their own interpretations are meaningful, are fun for people to do, and engaging, are good for the author's creativity, that authors will want to continue creating pieces of work for people's own interpretation, that these are actually educational and have an informative quality, and that this work that is created is to a high quality. How we win this debate is that we prove that the quality of literature gets worse because authors are less inspired to create work because they think that their purpose is not being understood. We think that this means that people do not actually enjoy reading because the quality of literature has declined, so you will have you have more people dropping out of English class or not paying attention. We think this also means that people are less educated, which I think we can agree is a bad thing in general. We also think that the purpose of literature is oversimplified and it does not reach its goal. That is why we are proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, I now reverse the speaking order and welcome up the negating reply.
The author of Peter Rabbit is not going to be very happy if people misconstrue this as being some sort of deep metaphor of like colonization and taking land away from native people, right? For my reply, I have identified two main questions. Firstly, on which side gets better literary analysis, and secondly, on who gets the widest or biggest levels of engagement in their literacy. Firstly, what did we actually say and I think prove in this debate? I think we proved that we end up with more nuance in literature based on the fact that these individual authors all have personal experiences and they don't leave things up to interpretation for the individual readers, right? They literally say this is the reason that this has happened and that is why this outcome has occurred, as opposed to saying, I want you to figure out specifically why this group of people is most likely to engage in criminal activity, right? But secondly, we also create more critical thinking because we have proven that
people like to take the path of least resistance, right? They will draw their own conclusions on the other side and do not have any form of push from their educational system or their wider society to think more critically about the media that they are consuming. So if they want to decide that this is just a group of people who are whole heap of like no-gooders, like we hate them, terrible for society, they can do that under this affirmative side, whereas under our side we force them to consider all the factors. What did we hear from them? They just said no, because kids are going to feel disengaged in literacy. And because they are told what to think and all of that. I think even if this does happen, they still have, like that literally the fact that they are humans consuming any form of media, they have to draw an opinion, because as given by side affirming, you do not just stare at the page, right? Like you have to be thinking as you're consuming, like, I can't remember the word, as you're consuming all of this stuff, right? Which literally does mean that there is still a level of personal interpretation and analysis. They just give it more weight to what the author's initial intentions actually were under our side. But I think they also proved how this has impact wider than just the classroom. And towards the end of Af's case, it seems that this is the only real impact where they can claim any form of benefit, right? Is the actual classroom. And I don't think that this can be weighed very highly in this debate, because we've literally proved the wider societal impact of when people misinterpret all of this, like, literature. And how it impacts on their like engagement with other humans in society, right? So what do we actually win on within this point of clash? We win on the actual security of complex and nuanced views. We do not leave it up to some like random person with already racist interpretations or already racist ideals to further their like personal opinions. Okay, secondly, on who gets the widest levels of engagement. So in terms of actual content, I think we've given a lot of mechanisms that have gone largely undisputed on why different authors are capable of creating different content, right? You're not literally just going to be studying Shakespeare in a classroom, as has been pushed. You will get like that nuance that they are trying to claim. So like at the very best for side affirmative, this is going to be symmetrical, but I don't actually think it is symmetrical for them. They say that the classroom is going to be more engaging because you can like form your own opinion. Again, we've given a lot of mechanisms as to why this is more harmful than it is beneficial. And what have we said that hasn't actually been interacted with is Ella's entire second point on how like quality is going to decrease. And then also on media literacy, neither of these things were really engaged with. So I think those two still stand by the end of today's debate and for this being fun.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and now welcome up the affirming reply to conclude today's debate.
People don't engage in literature if they're not enjoying the literature in which they're forced to engage. We are the side that gets people actually enjoying reading, watching movies, and analysing these things. We are the side that gets the benefits of engagement. Alright. A couple things to look in the speech. Firstly, on the amount of engagement. Secondly, on the quality of engagement. And finally, on the impacts to authors. Okay, firstly on the amount of engagement. This is the most important thing here because of scale. Everyone has to deal with literature in their lives. And so by making their experiences with it better, you just affect a huge number of people, you get a large amount of change. Okay. What did we tell you on this point? We told you that we get more people engaging in literature because they just like it more. They like reading more, they like watching films more. This was for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a more personalised experience. Secondly, it's just more interesting when you're not being told what to think and you get to go through the process of deciding what the message is. And thirdly, it's just more inviting. Your imagination is more encouraged. The benefits here were twofold. Firstly, people are just more motivated and broadly happy in class or whenever they are engaging with literature. But secondly, people just feel more encouraged to consume a set of information like a piece of literature and form a value judgment, as well as listening and being open to a range of other viewpoints which are obviously inevitably going to occur because everyone is different, everyone interprets text differently. These, by the way, are the characteristics that make the most productive change makers in society. These characteristics of being able to form judgments based on the information that is given to you, right? Instead of just being told what to think. That is where the benefits of literature are unlocked, because that is where people's thought processes are actually going to be changed in the long run. Nick does not sufficiently push back to prove why they get people actually enjoying literature more. So I think at the end of this, you should believe that we get the benefits of increased engagement. That is capability alone. Next thing on the quality of engagement. Look, Nick's material here was that firstly, people are still going to be thinking for themselves. But what we told you though, is that when you're told that you shouldn't even bother thinking for yourself in the English classroom, because that's going to get you not achieved and you need to write about what the author thought about, that is when you get people just having no genuine reason, no incentive in the classroom and in the context in which they're engaging in literature to even care enough to make their own judgments. But secondly, and I think what was their key push, was that when you focus on the author's purpose, that leads to more nuance in messages. Okay. We told you that the true nuance in the complex issues that can be found in literature is actually achieved when everyone who consumes it is encouraged to challenge the facts that they consume and experience varying views from others. We tell you that this is where you get this nuance actually being revealed. Nick never really engages with the likely scope of this debate, which is just standard literature that isn't intensely political, because most people just aren't reading the Communist Manifesto for fun. Most people are probably just reading the average novel, maybe that. So what we tell you that this actually looks like is just reading a romance novel and deciding whether or not the characters were right to act in the ways that they did irrationally for their love, whether they were right to make sacrifices for these things. That is where you get people, in the vast majority of cases, developing the skills to identify that there is nuance in the human condition, there is nuance in societal issues, because that is the reflection of the society that we live in. Things aren't just black and white, things aren't just your opinion versus the author's. There are a range of things. We are the side that fosters that. We tell you that people under our side understand the world and all of its nuance. People understand how to interact with it. That is where you get the benefits of engagement. The next thing then is on authors, which I don't think you should rate particularly highly because of the reasons that I gave you on scale earlier. Look, we tell you that people are still going to be understanding the text because it is just the same text. There's only so much scope for people to be misinterpreting things entirely and get an entirely different meaning out of a book when it is just the same words at the end of the day. What we think then is that this just inherently deals with all of the material about authors not wanting to write because people misinterpret their books and think that it's about entirely different things. But also, we tell you that writers are probably just more likely to be writing for the sake of getting their message out there, not necessarily just for people to agree with it, because if they wanted people to agree with it, they wanted to share propaganda, they wouldn't be authors in the first place.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite both teams to stand up, cross the floor, shake hands, and move out into the hallway.
That was